Welcome to my podcast. Why didn't anyone tell me this? With my guests, we are discussing reproductive health issues, questions you may have about your health, and debunking some of the many myths around our health. And today, it is a great pleasure to talk to my dear friend, Dr. Zeynep Gurtin, about motherhood and specifically about older motherhood. And we were discussing what we should call this podcast. We've decided to call it Motherhood Over 40, but we're basically talking about older motherhood. And Zeynep is a lecturer in women's health at the Institute for Women's Health at UCL. She works with me. It's a great pleasure to have her as one of my co-workers. And she's an authority member at the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. She is a sociologist of reproduction and family life. And for the past 2 decades, her work has focused on women's experiences of infertility, fertility treatments, and family building. She completed her PhD at the University of Cambridge and worked there with Professors Sarah Franklin and Susan Gollenblock. She also spent 2 years working at a fertility clinic, focusing on researching the social and emotional aspects of egg freezing and single women's fertility options and experiences. She is an experienced public communicator. She's spoken about fertility and assisted reproduction and gender relations at schools, city firms, arts festivals, and women's groups, both nationally and internationally. And her work has been extensively covered in the media, including BBC News, Women's Hour, The Guardian, The Independent, Sky News, Stylish Magazine, Glamour, and Grazia. Welcome, Zeynep.
Welcome. Thank you so much, Joyce, and thank you for the introduction.
It's always difficult. I hate it when anyone reads out my bio. I always feel embarrassed, but it's great to have you here. We're going to be talking about older motherhood over 40, because we both have experiences. So we are going to give our personal stories as well. But first, Zeynep, can I start by asking you about your career and why you wanted to work in the field of reproductive sociology?
Yeah, so when you sort of were telling me about the podcast, I was thinking about these questions. And it seems like quite a long time ago now that I did my master's in Cambridge. And I think initially the interest was just serendipity. You know, we had this amazing centre in Cambridge called the Centre for Family Research. And when I was an undergrad, all the papers I did in that centre, looking at things like genetics, inheritance, family relationships, sort of developmental psychology and family life, I just found all of that really fascinating. So when I decided to do a master's, I knew I wanted to continue working with the people in that centre. And so it was sort of, just feeling my way around. And then I ended up doing my PhD on couples' experiences of infertility and IVF in Turkey, which was really interesting. You know, at the time we were finding out more and more about people's experiences of IVF, and we didn't really know anything about IVF in many other countries. Marsha Inhorn had already done some really beautiful work in Egypt. So I sort of thought, well, maybe I could do that work in Turkey because I'm Turkish and I come from that culture, obviously. And so that's how it started. And it was just one thing snowballed into the next. And, I think you'll agree, it's just so endlessly fascinating. It's just a huge part of everybody's life, whether you have children or not, whether you go through fertility treatment or not. A lot of these questions that we spend our working lives thinking about are sort of at the very epicenter of what it means to be a human and what it means to sort of live and think about relationships. So I've sort of stayed working in the area.
Fantastic. I'm very, very glad that you did. And it's ironic for both of us that we started work in this field before we realised that we would be the other side of the table. But we'll come back to that later on. So you've worked on many different topics from what once you did in your master's and your PhD, and then on to egg freezing, and now your work on older motherhood. So can you tell us a bit more about these topics that you've been working on? So some of the really interesting parts about the great topics you're studying.
Yeah, and like you said, it's sort of really interesting the way my personal life has weaved in and out of my research interests. So I started, as I said, working on IVF and kind of looking at cultural differences in terms of assisted reproduction. And then I did some work on egg sharing, both donors and recipients' views about it, egg donation, cross-border reproductive care, then egg freezing and single women's reproductive options, and then sort of really focused on the idea of reproductive anxiety, the anxieties people have around being able to have children and then being able to do it in the right way. And interestingly, I decided before I became a mother that, so much of my personal experiences had ended up reflecting my work. So I specifically chose to work on motherhood over 40, and I thought, right, I'm going to do a project on this, and hopefully it will be a bit of a lucky charm for me. And then I did end up becoming a mother later on. So that was sort of the various topics I passed through to come here.
I can actually remember sitting in your office and you saying exactly that you didn't want to jinx things, and talking, for example, looking at childlessness, working on motherhood over 40, hopefully would be a good omen. And it certainly was for you. So tell us more about
exactly.
tell us more about your interest in motherhood over 40, as you did start doing this before you actually became a mother. So tell us more about how that came about.
Yeah, so this sort of emerged pretty organically from my work on single women's fertility options and egg freezing, and seeing women using egg donation and sperm donation in fertility clinics. And I realized that there is a growing number of women for whom motherhood is something that they come to much later in life, and much later than they would have originally expected. And actually, one of the things I think is interesting is, although the numbers are growing and growing, many of these women see themselves as very unusual or outliers. So I sort of wanted to do a piece of research to really understand what's happening socially. Why are we seeing an increase in later motherhood? And in order to do that, you can look at some large data sets, which is I use those as secondary material, data sets produced by the Office of National Statistics, or the fertility trends reports from the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. But what I really wanted to look at myself was sort of the qualitative data, looking at what are the emotional and relationship contexts within which women are becoming mothers after the age of 40. So what are their individual stories? What are their personal circumstances? So that was kind of the broad aim of the project, to kind of give color to the real life stories behind the statistics we were seeing.
So in the research I've done and others, if you ask women what age would they like to have children, most of them, even today, when I wanted to have children 30 years ago, I said age 30. And I thought the women, when you ask them now, would say a later age, because we're seeing this movement to older motherhood. But they didn't. The average was age 30. They still want children around age 30. But as you said, we're seeing globally now the age of motherhood increasing, and it goes up every year. We look at the data. It depends what sort of data you look at, but it's over 30 in many countries now, over age 30. So why do you think this is? Why do you think we're seeing this increase in older motherhood?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Firstly, the women I speak to as well, in most part, they say they didn't deliberately intend to become mothers in their 40s. Ideally, they would already have been mothers, and there's often been hiccups along the way. And that might be hiccups in terms of dissolution of relationships. So people who've been in marriages where they thought they were going to have children, and then the marriages broke up. So they had to they suddenly found themselves back on the dating market in their, early 30s. And then they formed, partnerships, and then found somebody else that they wanted to have a family with, or they just were not in the right relationship. Also financial reasons, difficulty achieving the kind of traditional milestones that we expect for people to have before they embark on parenthood, particularly in a sort of, middle class urban context where people expect to have their own houses, they expect to have established themselves in their career. We're hitting those milestones much later. And also just things to do with, the cost of living. And then even after all of those things are taken into account, for some women, actually, from the point where they started trying to have a child to actually becoming a mother was a sort of a very protracted and elongated process. So, it wasn't that they were trying to become a mum for the very first time when they were 43. They'd already been trying for 5 or 6 years and had, reproductive loss and miscarriages and things like that. So there's sort of slightly different factors. In my work, I've tried to theorize that as sort of 4, like in a quadrant, 4 different push and pull factors. So there are factors to do with social factors. So the pull ones might be about wanting to spend longer time in the labor market before you have children, women spending longer time in education, women having more freedom, sort of more open-minded approach to child-free life and things like that. And then the push factors, some of these that I've already talked about, like difficulty achieving milestones and economic precarity. But then we also have the pull and push factors from a reproductive perspective. So things that once women decide to try for a child slightly later in life, make it more difficult to conceive, like the higher risks and the higher likelihood of miscarriages. And then things that might aid them, like all the reproductive technologies we're going to talk about, like egg freezing and egg donation and things like that. So lots and lots of different things going on. But I was just looking, actually, again, in preparation, just to make sure I got my figures right. But for the last year that we have data for from the Office of National Statistics, 2021, 1 in 20 births were to women over 40. So that's much higher than I think many people would assume.
Yeah. Are there other trends that you've observed in the number of women choosing to have children later in life? So I think it's, as you say, in an ideal world, I think most women would like to have children earlier. And the second podcast in this series of Motherhood was with Mel Johnson, and she talked about, being aware of her biological clock and then deciding to go down the solo motherhood route. And then the last podcast with Lucy Vanderville, we talked, and we're going to talk more about egg freezing as an option. So there are options for women nowadays. But 30 years ago when I was trying, there wasn't egg freezing. Solo motherhood was really unusual at that time, even though I did consider it. And I think, as you said, it's so tricky for women in the they've got the workplace, they've got all these social factors, and one factor is trying to find someone who's ready and willing to have children with them. So what about the other trends that you've observed in women having children later in life?
Yeah, so the average age of births in England and Wales now is 31. And that's been, steadily increasing. And this sense of postponement of births is not just in the UK. Obviously, we're seeing that globally. We're seeing it right across the developed world. We're even seeing it in, developing countries where, it's rising, but from lower levels. So it's a general trend that we're seeing. But I think there's sort of 2 things happening at once. It's not that women don't want to delay having children. Women nowadays do want to delay it compared to their own mother's generation. So, but there is the deliberate delay, which might be, like you say, to age 30, for example, as opposed to, early 20s for their mother's generation or mid 20s. But I think there is also the unintentional postponement, which arises due to some of those social factors that are out of people's control. The main one being in relationships, whether or not they're in the right relationship they feel to have children, but also the difficulty of reproduction as you become older. So, some of the women that I've interviewed who are mothers over 40, they might say, well, ideally I would have had a kid when I was 34 or 35 or 36. So in a sense, if we look at kind of the averages, they did delay becoming mothers, beyond the average. They just didn't intended to be in their 40s. So that mixture of intentional and unintentional reasons.
Yeah. Is there any other data from your research interviewing women that you'd like to share with us?
I mean, I think the relationship piece is a really big piece, because again, the ONS data shows us that when we look at big data, we're seeing a massive change in terms of marriages and partnerships. So again, with the latest data, 65% of births were outside of marriages or civil partnerships, and that's the highest figure that we have. So on the one hand, it looks like, oh, it's sort of much more, we're much more liberated. And again, we're seeing a high increase of solo mums if we look at the HFEA data. But people are still really wedded to the idea of having children with the right person. So that might not necessarily mean a relationship, but that might not necessarily mean a marriage. But in most contexts, that does mean a relationship that people feel comfortable in. And that was by far the most important thing most women spoke about, that their relationships had broken down. They felt that dating in your 30s was really, unbalanced against women, that men of that age group were dating younger women who didn't yet want to have children, who were sort of more fun. And a lot of the men who were in their 40s who were dating were divorcees. They already had children from a previous relationship. They weren't interested in having children again, or there was sort of understandings around how many years you should be with somebody before you jumped into having children, or even talking about having children. So really that relationship piece was a super key piece. And I think also the kind of the emotional negotiation involved. So again, we can say from a statistical perspective, motherhood over 40 and child-free or childless living is becoming more and more common. But emotionally, for a lot of these women, they still felt like the odd one out in their social circles. Even if they thought about it, they did have other friends who were child-free or mothers later on. They would tell me, they would say, oh, well, all my friends got married and had kids in their early 30s. And if I sort of push them, really, is that true of all your friends? They might actually say, oh, well, actually, so-and-so doesn't, and so-and-so doesn't, and so-and-so doesn't, and so-and-so doesn't. But the feeling that they had was that they were living in a world where everybody else was coupled up with children, and that they were kind of playing catch up. So I think that was also the kind of the really salient emotional piece for most people. There were some others who were perfectly happy and actually had really made the most of their freedom in their 30s, but they were more in the minority.
Yeah, so we've talked about the age that women are having children, and the other statistic we see is the fertility rate. And this is a rate given for individual countries, and it's the average number of children that a woman has. And when I was young, it was 2.4 children. So a woman would have 2.4 children. But our research and others show that even though most people today still want 2 to 3 children, in many countries, the fertility rate is hovering around 1, even in many EU countries such as Italy, Malta, and then we've got I think it's South Korea where it's and Seoul where it's under 1, quite a lot under 1. So this means that a couple or a woman, an individual woman, is only having 1 child or less. So what's your view about the fertility rate decreasing in almost every country?
Yeah, I mean, these things go together, right? So the later you start your parenting life, the shorter time span you have in which to complete your family. And that means some people miss out on having families or miss out on having the number of children that they might want. So some demographers talk about this particular time period as a period of late and low fertility. So, those things go hand in hand, and that's really, really interesting. And again, when we look a bit deeper into the data, although, the COVID years were a slight blip where things were a bit different, generally the trend we're seeing is that fertility rates for all age groups up to 40 are going down. So all of those people are having less children than they used to. And the over 40s are the only group that are having more children than they used to. So as we push parenting further back, we just have much less time in which to have children. And I think also there are economic reasons why a lot of people feel that they can't have as many children as they might ideally like. And also climate reasons, childcare reasons. I mean, our society is not very well set up, even when you're in a very privileged position. And I mean, I'm saying this as somebody with 2 very small children right now. It's just, even when you are in a very lucky and very privileged position, it's enormously difficult to look after young children. And our society is not set up to really make it easier or to incentivize it for people to have more.
Yeah, and being the mother of 3 boys who are now all flying the nest and finally off to uni and things, I can tell people keep talking to someone mentioned to me yesterday about my savings. I said, savings? I said, I still owe a crazy amount on my mortgage because I could not, give my kids a good life without financially it affecting me. So yeah, I have not paid off my mortgage. Having kids are very, very expensive. And can I just ask you, so when I've looked at this, so it's interesting that countries like Sweden, where they have such support for parenting and they have great child support and nursery places, etc., but they are still affected by these numbers that we've looked at. So the fertility rate is still going down in Sweden, and the age women are having children is still going up in Sweden. So any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to look at the different pieces of the puzzle in different contexts, because there are some really culturally specific reasons. So I'm not an expert in sort of Scandinavian countries or, anywhere else. But I think, again, if we think about it in terms of these push and pull factors, it might be about different pieces of the puzzle. So I don't know what's going on in Sweden. I know they have much better parental leave policies, but perhaps, they have something different with regards to maybe, I don't know, climate concern or gender roles or something like that, that works as a push or a pull factor. So I think slightly different things are going on in different cultural contexts. But overall, adolescence is becoming elongated. Young adulthood is becoming elongated. Pressures of work life are exploding, So life is just looking different to how it looked 50 years ago. And, God knows what it's going to look like when this generation are adults. It's going to be even more different, particularly since this generation are growing up with social media. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, so we've definitely talked quite a lot now about these trends. We're seeing the age increase, the number of children decrease. There's definitely differences on how people are having children, but obviously very multifactorial about why that's happening. And so in this mini-series, I started with Tim Child, who talked about female fertility decline and the problems that creates. And that's one of the problems that women face. Men are fertile almost their whole life, but women we do have this biological clock. And in the last podcast with Lucy Vanderville, we talked about egg freezing and whether this is something that's going to be useful to help women preserve their fertility if they want to delay it for whatever reason. And I know this is a topic that you have researched a lot. So what is your view about egg freezing and what would you like women to know about it?
Okay, so that's a big question. I mean, I've done a lot of work on egg freezing, so I have nuanced and wide-ranging views about it. I think egg freezing, like all good technologies, really has its place. And it can be a brilliant piece of technology when it's used in the right way by the right people. I don't see it as something that can be applied wide scale or on a population level. First of all, it's incredibly expensive. So, most people can't even access it. And that's a really serious consideration. It's hugely commercialized. And that I find problematic for a medical technology, a reproductive technology, for it to be predominantly framed in commercial terms, which it is in our society and even more so in the US, I think is hugely problematic because people are then thinking about it in sort of terms of a luxury item or a desirable item as opposed to a medical procedure. Um, it doesn't have great success rates, so it's certainly not a guarantee, and it shouldn't be somebody's plan A or even plan B. It's certainly a fallback. But having said all that, when it works, it's amazing, and it can give women the ability to have, biologically related children at a later point in life than they otherwise would have been able to. Um, I think what we need is much clearer information about egg freezing so that women are making properly informed decisions, and that women for whom it's the right thing are able to access it and do it. And for women where it's not going to be of any tangible benefit, or the risks are too high, or it's too complicated, or whatever, then they also know that when they're making their decisions about their reproductive futures.
Yeah, I totally agree. You did a great bit of work with one of our students about how egg freezing is marketed to women and the selling points. And Lucy and I briefly talked about egg freezing parties. So do you think it's being pushed too much, too positively to too many women? As you said, you wouldn't want to see every woman
Yeah.
using this, and I certainly wouldn't.
Yeah, I do. And I think it's happening at two ends, and it's not, by no means is it just the fertility clinics doing it, because there's a sort of a broader culture around it now. But on the one hand, it's being marketed to young women, do this now when your eggs are in your prime. Well, why should young women do it? There's no reason why they would anticipate needing egg freezing. Most of those women are going to be absolutely fine. So why should they go through a medical procedure with inherent risks and side effects for something that's very unlikely to be of benefit to them? And then it's also marketed at much older women whose eggs are just not going to be viable, whose chance of success is going to be so minuscule that their money and their time and their emotional investment would be much better placed elsewhere. So yeah, I think that's definitely problematic.
Yeah, we're talking about motherhood over 40. So the fertility clinics tell me that they have many women come in their mid and late 40s asking for their eggs to be frozen. And it's a really difficult conversation because we know the figures from the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority for people that are going through what we call fresh IVF with eggs that weren't frozen. And we know the chances of getting pregnant in your mid 40s is very, very low. So with egg freezing, is it going to be any better if you were trying to freeze your eggs at that age? What's the data?
Yeah, no, we still don't have huge amounts of data for the success of egg freezing for own use, because most people who've frozen their eggs haven't come back to use them for various reasons, probably, right? Some of them have gone on to become probably parents without needing to use a clinic. Some of them maybe decided they weren't going to pursue motherhood. And of those that have come back, most of them froze their eggs quite some time ago. So there is some justifiability in saying, well, women who are having their eggs frozen right now could expect slightly higher levels of success. But if we sort of think about it logically and look at the success rates of IVF, those success rates are never going to be over 30%, even if you've frozen your eggs in your prime. As you said, when we look at success rates for IVF for women over 40, it's 5%. That's a very low success rate. That doesn't mean to say that a woman over 40 shouldn't be allowed to have IVF if she understands that those are her chances. If she understands that, and she understands the process, and she wants to go through it anyway, then I think it's really important that she's able to do that. But, the idea that a woman in her 40s is freezing eggs thinking she's giving herself a strong chance at some point is just, it's a bit, it's quite painful, really. I mean, the oldest woman I interviewed who'd frozen her eggs was 44.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel that she had comprehensive and accurate information regarding her chances of becoming a mother using those eggs. That's not to say she wasn't told. Sometimes people are told things and then they don't take them in. So I only know what she told me, but it was a difficult conversation.
Yeah, I think the clinicians would say that we did tell them all of that, but they didn't listen, and they were just set on doing it no matter what the chance of their success. Now, in the UK, we were governed until relatively recently, something that you and I and many others fought to get overturned. We had a 10-year limit, so you could only freeze your eggs for 10 years, which was an absolutely crazy rule because, as we're saying, you should freeze them when you're younger, maybe around 30, 35, and you may want to use them when you're older than that. You probably will want to use them when you're older than that. But where do you think this might go? You mentioned that it's probably going to be very different of how future generations have children. So if more women freeze their eggs, do you think we won't be talking about motherhood over 40? We'll be talking about motherhood over 50. Do you think that's on the horizon? We see some celebrities doing this already.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think my feeling is that those are outliers. And actually, what I think is more likely to happen is that over the course of the next two generations, and most people disagree with me on this, but my feeling is that we're going to see the age of motherhood start to come down again, simply because of intergenerational relationships. A lot of young women are already telling me that their mothers are telling them, don't leave it late. I really want to be a grandmother, and don't make the same mistakes I've made. And young women talking about their parents financially assisting them so that they can be ready to have children earlier. So I think there's a lot of investment in people wanting to become grandparents. And if that generation can help their children maybe reach those milestones a little bit earlier. I mean, I certainly don't think that what we're going to see is sort of whole scale egg freezing and then women delaying childbearing. What might happen is more and more young women will freeze their eggs, because I think there's a huge commercial push for that to happen. So I think that will happen, but I don't think a huge number of them will become mothers using those eggs. So they'll just be, millions of eggs sitting in tanks in different clinics. And I don't think that's ever going to be the default mode of achieving parenthood.
Now, they used to call mothers who had children later in life, I think the age actually they started using this term was, I think it was over 30 or over 35, but geriatric mothers, which no one should say anymore, but it was a term that people used. And the older a woman gets, there are some health issues with actually, getting pregnant and then carrying the pregnancy. So is there anything you'd like to tell us about that? What are the advantages and disadvantages of becoming a mother over 40 and health risks?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the stigma associated with older motherhood is changing because it's becoming more and more common. But again, it is very dependent on areas. So, for example, if you happen to be in inner London and your hospital is UCLH and you're over 40, nobody's going to bat an eyelid. None of the midwives or obstetricians are going to bat an eyelid. That might not be true in other places, even within the UK, for example. So I think it still sort of depends where you are. The term geriatric mother, it sounds very outdated, doesn't it? I think a lot of women who are in their 40s don't feel geriatric. A lot of us are very fit and healthy. And so, it just sort of sounds very outdated. And I think a lot of people find it a bit insulting or something like that. But yeah, no, I think there's certainly fast change with regards to stigmas and taboos and things like that. Yeah. Oh,
So,
I was going to say
yeah,
what I was going to say. um, I mean, with regards to the medical risks, I'm certainly not the best person to talk about those because I don't come at things from a medical perspective. I'm a sociologist. But obviously, our bodies are not the same when we're in our 40s as they might be in our 20s. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. And that's just one element um, that might be part of the consideration. I definitely think there are also advantages to becoming a parent in your 40s. Your personality is much more established, you appreciate it a lot more, you're much more patient, you have many more resources to offer your children. Um, you're you're sort of much more grounded in your sense of self, and I think you just sort of don't feel like you're missing out in the way that younger parents might do.
yeah, I think society, we have really changed how we view every age. They're always saying, 40 is the new 20, and well, I'm 61. 61's the new 18. We have we have changed how we view age, I think. But do you still think there's a bit of a stigma for the older mother? So we've talked about the geriatric mother, but men are normally celebrated. They're patted on the back if they've got their young wife pregnant. And we have huge number of male celebrities and politicians and pop stars and things, and they're fathering children in their 70s and 80s. But with motherhood, it certainly years ago it was definitely more frowned upon. I do think, as I said about the celebrities, we're seeing more and more having children around the age of 50. So it's sort of creeping in there. So do you think society still stigmatizes
Mm.
older motherhood?
Do you know what people have told me, women I've interviewed have told me, is that they were really worried that they would get negative reactions, when people saw them pregnant or when they saw them with babies, and that they never did receive those negative reactions. If anything, people were extremely happy for them. They were overjoyed. And, that's across the board. That's for solo moms, that's for women using donor sperm, that's for women using donor eggs, etc. So I think there's a two-tier thing happening. Certainly in the media, we can often see some really judgmental headlines about women. And, the tabloid media does not treat women very well. The tabloid media make a lot of their money from objectifying women. You're either too young or you're too old, you're too made up, you're not wearing enough makeup, you're thin, you're fat. So it's kind of not surprising to me that the tabloid media are extremely judgmental when it comes to older mothers. These incredible celebrities who look so fit and healthy and have huge pregnant bellies, and the media are sort of saying that they're selfish or this and that. But I don't think that is what's happening in communities, in people's lives. So I think there is that media discourse, but I don't think, just in the same way that the tabloid media are so obsessed and critical about women's looks, but that is not the way how anybody speaks to their friend, or that's not the kind of judgment you receive from your friends. If anything, what the women I've interviewed have told me is that because people knew how much they wanted to become a mother, they were, even more supportive. They were incredibly delighted for them. They were overjoyed. Their baby was welcomed with open arms. So I think in real life, in real communities, there is actually a level of joy and respect that goes with, people pursuing these dreams, especially when others know that it's come through, after years of hurdles and struggles. So I certainly wouldn't want anyone to have that as a deterrent in their mind, because I don't think it's really a real life experience. Sometimes women do say, oh, I was shopping with my 3-year-old in Waitrose or whatever, and then someone said, oh, is that, go back to your granny, or so there are times when women talk about being mistaken for a grandparent, and some women find that funny, some women find that a little bit hurtful, but that's unintentional. And I've very, very rarely heard any negative comments or criticisms that women have received for becoming mothers older.
Yeah, that is a really good move. I love what you said there about society has embraced all these different ways of motherhood much more than 20, 30 years ago. And I loved at the the Olympics, seeing a number of pregnant women breastfeeding mothers. It was just great. I don't remember seeing that so often before. I think we've embraced motherhood, and we're getting out there and showing the world that it's a beautiful thing. I want to share a little
Mm.
bit about my story, which most of you have heard before. But so my life plan was to have my first child at 30. My partner wasn't ready. We didn't have egg freezing then. If we did, I think I'd have had a very different life. But um, it took me 7 years to have my three children. And I had my first child at 39 and my twins from frozen embryos at 42. So actually, I had my first child just a couple of weeks before my 40th birthday. And so I've been in this difficult journey, even though that wasn't my plan A, to be an older
Mm.
mother. And I know, Zeynep, that you had a really difficult journey to motherhood as well. Did you want to tell us about your journey?
Yeah, and you know, Joyce, I think your story and my story, like there are so many commonalities in a lot of these stories. Similarly, my intention, my life plan, if you'd asked me when I was a young girl, I was very focused on a family. I really knew I wanted to become a mum. That was so important to me. Um, so I actually got married very young. I got married at 23, and then I was divorced at 31, which, now I'm very thankful that that happened. But at the same time, it completely blindsided me. I was really at the point where I was ready to have a family, and that's what I was thinking. And then when that relationship ended, um, it took me a few years to really sort of put myself back together and then think about starting a new relationship. And then I sort of ricocheted between some uh, fairly unsuitable relationships for a while. And so by the time I met my current partner, I was 35. And initially, he was not sure about whether he wanted children or how quick he might want children. So I actually did freeze my eggs. And, this is what I always say when I talk about egg freezing as well. I'm critical of its over commercialization, but I'm not critical of the technology. I think it certainly has its place. Um, and then once we did start trying, and I think I was probably 37, or I wouldn't say started trying, stopped not trying. Once we stopped not trying, I did get pregnant fairly easily, but I had a lot of miscarriages. And so that was a brutal few years. And that's what took us to IVF to try and understand what was happening. And then I continued having miscarriages with IVF pregnancies, which was really, so difficult. So, there's a couple of years there that I don't really like to think about those years because it was so painful. And I really felt like I was leading a bit of a split life, because I had to go out into the world and put on a face and lecture or whatever. And I was just emotionally in a lot of pain, in a lot of uncertainty. I didn't know whether it was going to happen. I didn't know whether I had the strength to try again. And actually, weirdly for us, um, I know it was a terrible time globally and for most people, but the COVID lockdown was sort of a time where I could just um, be a bit more still and rest a bit. So my first son, Sammy, I was pregnant with him during the COVID lockdowns, which was quite helpful because I was a very anxious pregnant person, having had lots of miscarriages. And so I could just stay at home. Nobody knew about it. We didn't even tell our families until I think I was about 24 or 25 weeks, um, because we didn't want to get other people's hopes up and then dash them. We didn't want to sort of jinx it for ourselves. So by the time we told even our parents, we were like, we're having a baby and very soon. so, um, and even, I remember on the day of I had a planned C-section. So it then transpired that I've got this sort of underlying bleeding condition, which is why I was having all the miscarriages. And on the day of my planned C-section, as we were leaving, going out of the door, I remember we saw our neighbor and she said, "Oh, where are you going?" And we said, "Oh, it's the C-section day." And I said, "Well, hopefully, next time you see us, we'll have a baby." And she said, "What do you mean, hopefully? I mean, this is it. You're going for a C-section. You are going to have a baby." But even at that point, I couldn't quite let myself believe it. So that was Sammy. And then yeah, it was just amazing, so wonderful to become a mom and to have him. And it was just, yeah, such joy. And then when he was very small, we sort of felt we would really love him to have a sibling. And so we thought we would go back and try with my frozen eggs that I'd frozen before. And so those eggs were then fertilized. And actually, I'd frozen 14 or 15 eggs, and we got the one healthy embryo. So the odds were so slim. It was so unlikely. But then that one embryo turned into Leonardo, my second son. So, it's just, Joyce, you and I, we talk about this. I feel so lucky. Oh, are you crying? Yeah, there are days when honestly I cannot believe my luck, because I know how unlikely and how against the odds it was. And my pregnancy with Leonardo was incredibly complicated and very risky. And I was on bed rest for a lot of it. And, and it's just like, I look at these two boys, Sammy usually comes into our bed. So in the morning I wake up with one either side, and I'm just like, wow, I get to live this life. So yeah, that was my story.
Thank you. Yes, I'm crying. I cry quite a bit on my podcast. So one of us cries normally. Zeynep, thank you. I always want to give you a hug. I can remember being there with you and having some of these discussions, and I remember a walk in Cambridge we had once, and several walks we had before COVID, during COVID, after COVID, and listening to what you went through. I've just been talking to a few therapist friends I know, some who've worked in the fertility field, and we've been talking about the trauma of infertility journeys, whether you have children or not. Do you? I certainly still feel traumatized by when I think back at what I went through, and that was 20 years ago. How are you feeling now when it's all still quite raw about what you went through?
Do you know what? Yeah, I think that is so, so important. And we haven't actually spoken about this. So it's amazing that you've picked it up and are bringing it up. But so my new sort of business that I'm starting is that I want to offer people debriefs, fertility debriefs, like both thinking about, do I want to use an egg donor? Do I want to freeze my eggs? Do I want to go for another cycle of IVF? But also giving them a space to talk through what their journey was and how they feel about it, because there's no space for that. And certainly within the IVF world, there is this slightly sort of unspoken understanding, and definitely from a medical perspective, if you got a healthy baby at the end of it, then, there's just sort of flat gratitude, you're happy, you're grateful, and that's that. Well, obviously, we're all much more complicated than that. And there has to be some space for women to talk non-judgmentally about the complicated feelings, not least the number of years you lost, not least the toll it took on your body, the toll it takes on your relationship, to keep going through loss, which, couples often deal with in quite different ways, the way that can become a presence within your relationship. And also the anxiety, the continuing anxiety when you've fought so hard to become a mum. It can be quite hard to relax into the fact that actually it's fine and you're safe and your babies are safe and no one's going to take them away from you. It's just, so I think that's just something so important to mention, and that there needs to be more spaces for that. So now it's becoming, increasingly common for women to have birth debriefs, right? Yes, birth, people used to say, oh, that's the most wonderful day in your life where you meet your baby. Well, actually, for a lot of women, birth can be pretty difficult and pretty traumatizing. And now we understand, like, actually having birth debriefs, not just for women for whom their birth was hugely traumatizing, but for many women can be a really important step, both in terms of deciding the rest of their reproductive journey, but also in terms of just being able to put that to one side and get on with their lives. And I think it's just as important to have a fertility debrief, whatever your journey was. So yeah, I completely agree with you, Joyce.
Yes, great work, Zeynep. I totally agree. I like using debriefs. That's a nice way of saying it, because I think with so many things we go through in life, if it's a physical issue, we go and get treatment. If there's an issue that affects our mental health, we don't. And I think more people are doing that and certainly going that way. But I really encourage people, go and get help. If you had a bereavement, if you had a miscarriage, if you've had infertility, whatever your issue, go and get professional help. We should really be doing this. So coming to see someone like you who's had the experience, I think will be absolutely fantastic. Okay, let's move on to being a mother. Now we're both mothers. I think one difficult thing is that I've been aware of. I do lots of work around menopause and perimenopause. If you have your children over 40, then you are going to start hitting the perimenopause pretty soon. So most symptoms will start somewhere around your mid 40s, if not earlier. That certainly happened to me. I had a few more years of periods after I had my twins, and then everything stopped. So I think this issue of going through the perimenopause when you've got small children, and when you've got small children, you're sleep deprived, you're tired, everything else. And I think what we're seeing is these perimenopause symptoms really being exacerbated even more. So I know I've briefly mentioned this to you because we've talked about sleep deprivation. I think that sleep deprivation is the biggest problem for perimenopausal women, because they're having hot flushes or other problems that are affecting their sleep, and then they're just feeling absolutely terrible during the day. So what about a young mother, a mother with young children entering perimenopause?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think I'm probably there. And it's very difficult when you have young children. It's really, really difficult to carve out time for yourself. I mean, it's financially difficult because, if you're going to go for a massage or you're going to go for a run, you're like, is that worth, X amount per hour of childcare? And also there's so many competing demands. Like, do you manage your household? Do you do your full-time job? Do you try and see a friend? Do you do, I think something gives. Yeah, I mean, I think essentially all of this has to, we just need to try and tackle these issues in a more socially cohesive way. It's really difficult to put all of this on individual shoulders. I was talking with a friend the other day and we're like, this is crazy. We're all in our little houses having a really hard time, just practically managing things, financially managing things, and just having enough energy, having enough sleep. I mean, this is insane. Like, why is society set up in this way? And I think we're moving in the right direction, with flexible working, with employers developing better childcare arrangements and, fertility friendly policies. I think all of that is really, really important. And that's like a key part of that puzzle. And I think the work that you're doing with bringing more awareness of the menopause, especially to workplaces, which is where most of us are spending most of our waking hours, is really, really crucial. And I think, employers need to realize that if you keep your workforce healthy, if you give them opportunities to, I don't know, exercise at lunchtime, leave work early, do this, do that, like, productivity is going to increase and they're going to be just a happier, healthier, more productive workforce. I mean, even if you just look at it from that perspective. So yeah, I mean, I would really like to have had a bit of a break, like physically, between, the onslaught of fertility treatments and then having to think about the menopause. But I think you're absolutely right that a lot of women who become mothers in their 40s are going to have to negotiate those things at the same time: very young children and perimenopause.
So I think we need to get perimenopause education in toddler groups, which I hadn't thought about before our
That's a
discussions.
good idea.
Honestly, I really think we do, and I just want women to be aware that with being a mother of young children, I think they might have they've got so much on their mind. Probably the last thing they're going to think about is perimenopause. So, and I'm really a big
Yeah.
fan of women's circles and women being together with other women going through similar life stages. So I think if you are a mother, if you have experienced motherhood over 40, I think be very aware that the perimenopause is knocking at your door, and some of your issues are definitely going to be compounded by your hormones going crazy, which they do when you're having a baby anyway, and then they're going crazy again. And one last thing I want to say was I've been doing interviews with women over 50 for my book, and very aware that those that still had children at home, including me, I think we're feeling a bit frustrated. So right at the beginning of this, you said that people are delaying having children because they're having such a great time being young and doing all these things that they're living their lives. But also post-menopause, I think, is a really enlightening second spring for women. And the next series in this podcast is actually going to be on embracing age and embracing our second spring. So if you've still got kids at home, they do put a bit of dampener on it. But I think that's a good argument for actually, if you're thinking, oh, I'll have them later, I want to enjoy life now, but there is a real advantage to having them younger and enjoying the wonderful adventure that happens when you stop your menstrual cycle, stop your fertile years, and enjoy the wonderful time of postmenopause. I think most people can't think that far ahead, probably.
No. But you know what? When I was about to become a mother for the first time, my friends organized this sort of day for me. And what I asked is I asked everybody to give me one piece of advice and one wish for the baby. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from one of my friends at the time, she said, pick people who you admire in their mothering. Oh, that makes me emotional. But she said, pick people who you admire in their mothering, and keep them in your sight, so that when you don't know what to do or when you feel frustrated, you can kind of look at them for examples. And so I do that. I think that's a brilliant piece of advice. And I have to say, Joyce, you are so inspiring. And, if I can be, no, but honestly, if I can be half the mum that you are to your boys, while also being just the most infectiously energetic, positive, supportive, alive person, then I will be extremely happy. I think you set a really beautiful example for those of us coming hopefully behind you in your footsteps. I really genuinely mean that. You know that. Yeah, so especially when I was working in the fertility clinic, fertility decline, age-related fertility decline was something people constantly said, well, how come I didn't know that? I think that's the messages got out there now. IVF success rates being as low as they are, the overall IVF success rates are about 35%. I think that's a big one. Why didn't anyone tell me this? But I think, the thing I've tried to tell people, which I think is really important, is that even when your life journey looks different to what you had expected, or it looks different to what you see in your friends, what you see in your immediate network, that doesn't mean that you're all on your own or that you're the odd one out, because and that's what I meant by marrying the statistics with the individual experiences. I so often in the egg freezing research came across women who just felt that they were the only person who hadn't yet had a child. They were the only woman in her late 30s who didn't have a partner or a child or whatever. And I was saying, well, actually, this is a thing. There are now more and more women in your situation. And we actually started a single women's sort of social evening, support group social evening, once a month, which was so well attended with Cindy Charles. And Cindy was so brilliant at running those events. And it was really such an important place, because women would come and at the end of the evening, they would leave going, oh, I just met all these women and they're all so cool. So it makes me feel that a lot better about my life. And, so I think, why didn't anyone tell me that there were all these other women like me around, I think, as a big one as well. Yeah. Oh. My family. Obviously, yeah, my family makes me so happy, and just spending the day together, my boys, my dog, my partner, sunset, watching the sunset. If I can watch a sunset, I'm very happy, which doesn't really happen in London, but we were on holiday in Cornwall a few weeks ago where we could see the sunset from the living room every day, and I was so happy. My goal for the day was like, if we can get the boys asleep by sunset, which was good because it was July, so the sun was setting really late, so it was an achievable goal. And then just watching that sunset, the sea, I think my happy place. So I was saying to a friend the other day, for a very long time, for over 10 years now, the goal that I've been trying to get to has been being a mum, and being a mum of 2 children, because I always wanted my children to have siblings. And then now that Leonardo has been born, he turned 1 last week. I'm like, oh, what's the next thing I want in life? Because here I am. This is what I've been wanting for over a decade. And I think my next thing, my happy place in my mind, is a little cottage by the sea, somewhere nice and rural, where I can watch the sunset and my boys can go on the beach and learn to surf and swim, and somewhere where we could go. That's sort of my mental happy place right now. Oh, yeah. Or have a big garden that you can sit in. Ooh. Do you know, the first thing that popped into my head was to be a bit less uptight. I think I was probably, I'm a worrier by nature. I think too much. I ruminate. I'm oversensitive. I think if I had had more belief that things were going to work out, I would have probably saved myself quite a bit of heartache along the way. So that might be my advice to my younger self. Just believe that it's all going to be okay. Oh. So lovely to spend this time with you, Joyce. Lots of love.